Have you ever been judged just by the way you walked into a room? Have you ever been looked at with suspicion, even when you knew you absolutely belonged there? She didn't scream. She didn't protest. Not a single complaint. But it was her silence that shook an entire airline to its core. Right after this, you'll witness a woman being forced out of her first-class seat, simply because she didn't look like someone who usually sits there. But just a few hours later, the situation flipped. And the outcome? No one, not even the one who humiliated her, could have seen it coming. In this video, you'll join me on the quiet yet powerful journey of a black woman facing discrimination right in the heart of a first-class cabin. How she turned a personal insult into a sweeping systemic reform. And a deep lesson, why silence, when timed and used right, can be the most powerful form of resistance. But before we dive deeper into her story, I want you to ask yourself, if you were sitting next to someone being publicly disrespected, would you speak up, or just look away? If that question makes you hesitate, then this is the story you need to hear. That day, the airport was as usual, crowded, hurried, a stream of people trailing through security gates. Jade Williams entered the first-class cabin with the calm confidence of someone familiar with long journeys. She wore a tailored charcoal blazer, her natural curls framing a face both intelligent and gentle. One hand carried a laptop bag, the other, her boarding pass. There was nothing unusual about her, except that she was a black woman, and confident. She found her seat, offered a gentle smile to the passenger next to her, stowed her belongings, and sat down like anyone else. Quiet. Orderly. Exactly how a first-class passenger is expected to behave. But sometimes, silence makes people more uncomfortable than noise. And sometimes, just looking different, is enough to make you the center of attention. We live in a society that glorifies gut feeling, that thing we call a first impression. But here's a truth we rarely say out loud: first impressions often reflect bias more than reality. So many have been wrongly judged, not because they lacked capability, but because they didn't fit a familiar mold. Think of Oprah Winfrey, once denied service at a designer handbag store because that bag wasn't for her. Or Serena Williams, described by the media as too aggressive just for expressing emotion in a match, the very thing male players are praised for as passion. Jade was no different. Her composure didn't comfort people. It unsettled them. I once heard a teacher say, "Prejudice doesn't always come from malice. Sometimes, it's just from looking at the world through a fogged-up lens. And sometimes, the moments that seem most peaceful, are the quiet before a storm." There were no warning signs. Just the eyes of a flight attendant. A quick glance. A furrowed brow. And then, a seemingly innocent question rang out. "Excuse me, may I see your ticket again?" The first sound of the storm had just begun. Let's continue with the next part, a question that shouldn't be asked, "Can I see your ticket?" where a question that seems simple, unravels into consequences no one could have predicted. Jade looked up. The question had been asked with polite words, but it couldn't hide the doubt. The flight attendant, Emily Brooks, stood before her, looking immaculate, eyes scanning. "May I see your ticket again?" Jade gave a soft smile, no other reaction. She calmly handed over her boarding pass, not a hint of hesitation. Emily looked at it. Her brow furrowed slightly, just enough for someone observant to notice. First class. And then, without an apology, she turned and walked away. The problem wasn't the question. The problem was, who was being asked. Because think about it, how many times have you seen a white man in a hoodie be asked to show his first-class ticket? Why is it that a black woman, dressed professionally, in her assigned seat, behaving appropriately, is the one being doubted? This wasn't the first time something like this had happened. In 2022, Joseph Grant, an African-American engineer, was asked to leave the business class cabin even though his ticket was valid, because the flight attendant couldn't believe he could afford it. In 2019, an Asian woman was repeatedly asked why she was flying alone on a long flight, while no one questioned the other passengers. This so-called gut feeling, professional instinct, is often nothing more than quiet bias. And worse, when wrapped in the label of safety protocol, it becomes a very smooth vehicle for injustice. I remember a friend once told me, as a person of color, you don't just have to be better, you have to fit in, look like what people expect in that position. But Jade never wanted to fit in. She didn't argue. She didn't show frustration. But her eyes, in that moment, said it all. I know this story. And this time, I won't let it slide. Because sometimes, calmness doesn't mean surrender. It is the beginning of quiet, but fierce, action. And it was exactly that. Just minutes later, when Emily returned, it was no longer about checking a ticket. It was, "You'll need to move to economy." The moment Jade stood up, picked up her bag, and walked through the rows of first-class seats. It wasn't just a relocation. It was an insult, carried out under the disguise of procedure. And in that moment, a decision was made. When Emily came back with confident steps, it was no longer a question. There was no apology. No thorough explanation. She simply said, "I need to ask you to move to the economy cabin. There may have been a system error." Jade stayed silent for a few seconds. She knew, her ticket was valid. Her information was correct. There was no error. But if you've ever been the one under scrutiny in a room where all eyes are on you, you'll understand, arguing in that moment would only make you seem like exactly what they don't expect in first class. Jade stood up. She picked up her laptop bag and walked between the seats, back straight, chin slightly raised. A simple walk down the aisle became a walk of humiliation. No one said a word. A few eyes followed. Some turned away quickly. As if, by not looking, they didn't have to care. They call it the walk of humiliation. The walk where you've done nothing wrong, but are treated like you don't belong. No shouting. No blatant insults. Just a small action, masked as procedure, and it's enough to make someone feel excluded. The truth is, this isn't unfamiliar. In 2017, Dr. David Deo, an Asian American doctor, was dragged off a United Airlines flight despite holding a valid ticket. The reason? A seat was needed for a crew member. In 2020, a black mother was asked to leave a high-end play area because the manager assumed, "You're not a member here, are you?" These silent walks, though without loud noises, leave deep wounds. Not because someone was kicked out, but because it happened, when they had done everything right. I once read a quote from Maya Angelou. "People will forget what you said, forget what you did, but they will never forget how you made them feel." And that day, in that airplane cabin, Jade was given a feeling she would never forget. Not because it was unbearable, but because it was the final drop, after so many times before, when she had chosen to remain silent. But unlike those other times, this time, Jade didn't just feel hurt. She felt, like something had to be done. And in that cramped economy cabin, dimly lit between narrow seats, Jade opened her phone. A short message was typed. No exclamation marks. No outrage. Just simply, "Call me when you land. It's begun." And indeed, it had begun. Just when someone seemed to be pushed out of the story, she was actually the one who started writing the next chapter. In that cramped economy cabin, Jade sat quietly by the window. She placed her bag beneath the seat, adjusted her sleeve, and unlocked her phone. No one around her knew, but one brief, precise phone call had already set the system in motion. She didn't cry. She didn't complain. She didn't immediately post about it on social media. But everything had already started to change. Elsewhere, flight attendant Emily was serving drinks in first class, her expression composed. But a question lingered in her mind. Why was she so calm? The answer was simple. Jade didn't need to be angry. Because when you truly know who you are, you don't need to raise your voice to be seen. You just need to act, at the right time. People often confuse calmness with passivity. But the truth is, calm is a choice, made by someone who understands their power. Someone who knows, not every battle needs swords to win. I remember an interview clip where Michelle Obama once said, "When they go low, we go high." And Jade, in that economy seat, had just started her ascent, in her own way. She didn't react impulsively. She prepared. She didn't make a scene. She observed. She didn't scream. But every move she made sent a clear message. I will not stay silent. I will not let this pass. But I also will not let my emotions take the lead. Throughout the flight, others may have only seen a woman quietly sitting in a middle row seat. But only a few could sense. Something was being set in motion, quietly, but unmistakably. A small lesson I once learned from a former boss. The one who yells the loudest isn't in control. The one who stays calm the longest, is. And Jade was that person. Because silence isn't weakness. It's strategy. And a good strategy doesn't need to be loud. We need to speak with Emily Brooks after this flight. The phone rang at the front of the cabin. A crew member picked up, listened quietly, then turned to Emily. They're asking for you. Just 3 words. But Emily felt the cabin temperature drop a few degrees. She picked up the receiver. The voice on the other end was calm, but not gentle. This is from the airline senior operations office. There has been a complaint involving a first-class passenger named Jade Williams. Please prepare a full report after landing. That was the moment Emily realized. She hadn't just handled a passenger. She had caused a small quake, and the ripples were spreading fast. We often think a small decision, like reassigning someone's seat, is internal business. A minor issue. But in a world where fairness is a core value, even a seemingly harmless act can unleash consequences far beyond anyone's expectations. Do you remember the 2017 incident? Dr. David Deo, a Vietnamese-American physician, dragged off a United Airlines flight for refusing to give up his seat. At first, the airline thought they were just handling a situation. But within hours, the whole world knew. Company stocks dropped by hundreds of millions, and the CEO had to publicly apologize on national television. One wrong step, if it violates human dignity, can trigger a domino effect. Because in today's world, injustice is not just a personal matter. It's a brand issue. An organizational issue. A societal issue. And here's the key. Jade didn't need to make a scene. She just acted at the right moment. She chose the right person to call. Said exactly what needed to be said. And just one message, delivered to the right recipient, was enough to make the entire system stop and listen. I remember a quote from social justice advocate Brian Stevenson, who has defended hundreds of clients subjected to racial discrimination. You don't need power to create change. You need persistence, and just enough courage not to stay silent. Jade had both. And the ripples were spreading. When an organization starts to realize it can be held accountable, it begins to listen. But listening doesn't mean understanding. And understanding doesn't always lead to change. Someone still has to ask the hard question. What kind of system allowed this to happen? And that's when the story shifted, from personal to collective. From one person being removed from her seat, to an entire industry needing to ask itself, who really gets to belong in that seat? Right after the call from headquarters, Emily sat quietly in first class, trying to carry on. She poured coffee, adjusted seats, smiled politely. But her hands trembled ever so slightly. Not because she feared being punished, but because, deep down, she began to wonder. Have I been wrong for a long time? When mistakes happen, we often look for someone to blame. But the truth is, a person usually acts the way the system allows them to. Emily wasn't a villain. She followed what the environment had taught her, even if never spoken aloud. That passengers who look unusual need extra checking. That suspicion is part of duty. That moving someone back, if done politely, is acceptable. That's how bias operates. Silently. Logically. Repeatedly, until it becomes normal. And do you know what's most dangerous? It's when the entire system believes its own bias is neutrality. In 2020, a Harvard Business Review study found, in the U.S. airline industry, black customers were 2.5 times more likely to be denied upgrades than white customers, even when ticket class and reward points were identical. In 2018, an Indian businesswoman named Shubnam Khan was asked to explain why she was wearing traditional clothing while flying in business class. That question wasn't in any airline policy. But it was asked, because in that staff member's mind, her appearance didn't match the expensive seat. These incidents aren't isolated. And they didn't appear from nowhere. They are the product of an organizational culture not yet brave enough to examine itself. Jade understood this. She knew Emily was just one link in a much larger chain. So her goal wasn't to get someone fired. It was to make the system ask, how are we training our staff? And why this way? I remember a TED Talk titled How to Deconstruct Racism, one headline at a time. The speaker, Bharathan Thurston, said something I've never forgotten. Racism isn't about people being bad. It's about systems being lazy. And because we're too lazy to change, we keep repeating old mistakes, with new faces, and new victims. That's why Jade didn't just file a complaint. She requested a full review of the entire training system and passenger handling protocol. Not to assign blame, but to prevent the next time. Because she knew, if we just change people, but not the process, the same mistake will repeat, just under a different name. Emily Brooks walked into the conference room, her hands tightly clasped. The room was cold, bright, with 3 people seated across the table. No one yelled. No one was hostile. But the air was thick, like one deep breath could shatter the carefully held facade of reasonable procedure. The first to speak was a silver-haired woman, calm but firm. We need you to explain why you asked passenger Jade Williams to leave the first-class cabin, even though her ticket was valid. Emily took a deep breath. I was just following protocol. I felt something was off. Just a feeling. The woman tilted her head, eyes never leaving Emily's face. Did you confirm with the system? No. Do you have any reason besides a feeling? I don't. And at that moment, every excuse Emily had rehearsed in her mind crumbled into silence. Because when the truth is reduced to nothing but a feeling, there's no place for bias to hide. The reality is, in service, especially aviation, every action must be grounded in procedure, not emotion. You can't change a passenger's seat just because they don't match your intuition. Especially when that intuition tends to falter most, in front of someone who looks different. I once read a study from Cornell University. In service industries, decisions based on gut feeling were wrong 62% of the time when race and gender were part of the scenario. That's no longer just instinct. That's a statistic. A mental shortcut, that, if not stopped, becomes a repeating cycle. Emily lowered her head, her voice shaking. I didn't think it would go this far. I just The man on the left gently interrupted. And that's the problem. People in those moments, they've never been allowed to think far. Because they're too busy, enduring actions like yours. The hearing didn't last long. Emily wasn't punished with severity. But she had to face something even heavier. The awareness that she was part of the problem. Not intentionally. Not maliciously. But still, someone who caused harm, by failing to look deeper. The lesson here isn't don't make mistakes. It's, when you do, don't make excuses. Face them. And most importantly, change. She left the room with a temporary suspension letter in hand. But in her heart, there was a new question. Is there a way for me to make this right, not just in action, but in thought? The next morning, soft sunlight poured through the glass windows of the airline's 20th floor office. Jade stepped in, carrying herself with the same calm poise as always. She wore a simple navy dress, her face lightly made up, a folder of documents in hand. Waiting for her was Richard Hale, the airline CEO. A man who had weathered multiple PR storms. But had never prepared as carefully for a meeting as he had for this one. "Thank you for coming," he began. "I want to start with an apology. We were wrong. And I know, a simple apology isn't enough." Jade nodded slightly, her expression serious, without bitterness. "I didn't come here for an apology," she replied. "I came to request change. This wasn't a personal issue anymore. It wasn't about one flight attendant lacking soft skills, or one passenger being mistreated. This was a system issue. A system that allowed unconscious bias to exist. A protocol that appeared professional, but lacked the most basic values, awareness, fairness, and human dignity." Jade opened her folder. Inside were a full evaluation of the current flight attendant training program. A report on similar complaints over the past 5 years. And a reform proposal built on 3 pillars. Diversity education, unconscious bias response, human-centered service culture. Jade didn't ask for compensation. She didn't demand anyone's termination. She simply said, "I don't need anyone to be removed from this system. I need the system to stop removing people like me." The meeting lasted over an hour. Richard listened, without interrupting. And when Jade finished her presentation, he sighed deeply. "We used to think that service training was enough. But maybe, we forgot to train humanity." In that moment, Jade was no longer just a passenger. She had become an agent of change. Not through shouting. Not through lawsuits. But through clarity, preparation, and quiet resolve. I remember a quote by Maya Angelou, author and civil rights activist. "There is no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside you." Jade didn't hold her story in. She told it, not just to protect herself, but to open a path so that others wouldn't have to tell that story again. And so, that meeting didn't end in awkwardness. It ended with a handshake, not for reconciliation, but for a beginning. A few days after her meeting with the CEO, just when it seemed like everything had settled, Jade received an email. No eye-catching subject line. No urgent flag. Just a name, Emily Brooks. Jade opened the email. "I don't really know how to begin, but I think the least I can do is write to you." The message wasn't long. It wasn't poetic. It didn't blame work pressure, exhaustion, or internal procedures. It was a raw piece of honesty, from someone trying to face herself. "I was wrong. And what weighs on me the most isn't the suspension. It's realizing. I didn't even think I had hurt you. All I felt was suspicion. And I forgot that the first thing I owed you, was respect." Jade read the letter to the end, quietly. She didn't cry. She didn't feel triumphant. She just felt lighter. Because sometimes, an apology can't erase the pain. but it shows that someone has begun to change. Not every apology is genuine. Many say I'm sorry just to avoid trouble. But Emily's was different. It came with no justification. It didn't beg for forgiveness. It simply said, I see now what I didn't before. And I won't close my eyes again. I recall a quote from the Book of Forgiving by Desmond Tutu. Forgiveness is not forgetting. It's remembering, and choosing to release. Jade didn't need to forgive right away. But she chose not to hold on to the anger forever. Because she knew, unspoken anger only exhausts the soul. She replied briefly. Thank you for your letter. Owning a mistake is the first step toward change. I hope you hold on to that courage, not just today, but in every day that follows. In the following weeks, the airline officially announced a series of reforms. A company-wide unconscious bias training program for all staff. A restructured complaint handling protocol prioritizing humanity. And most notably, the creation of a cultural advisory board, with Jade as one of its founding members. But perhaps the most powerful part was how the story spread beyond the cabin. It was shared at customer service training conferences. It became a case study in aviation schools. And it made other airlines take a hard look at themselves. Not because Jade was powerful, but because she was calm, clear, and relentless. She didn't use anger to win. She used her voice, her truth, and her unwavering presence. I remember watching Jade speak in a panel discussion on equity in the service industry. She said, I didn't act to become a symbol. I acted so no one else would have to go through what I did. And maybe, that's exactly what made her a symbol. The lesson here isn't just about airlines. Not about first-class tickets, cabin seats, or uniforms. It's about how we build a society where people are seen for their real worth, not through the mask of bias. That plane flew just like any other that day. But for Jade, and those who knew her story, it was the first flight on a much longer journey. A journey to shift how we think. Before this video ends, I just want to leave you with one question. What would you do, if you saw someone being removed from a place they absolutely belonged in? If this story moved you, don't leave in silence. Leave your thoughts below. Share it. Speak up. Because every big change begins with a small act. A share, a voice, a kind glance. And sometimes, you are the next one to spark that change.